reading then is taken from Luke chapter 22, beginning at verse 39. If you're following in the church Bibles, it can be found on page 1058. Luke 22, beginning at verse 39. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." Amen.
We have two health warnings to give you this morning. Okay, some of you will have heard the first before many times, and that is that occasionally when I'm speaking and I'm sharing about God's love, I get quite emotional, so I then cry. Okay, if that happens, nobody needs to panic. I don't need rescuing. I don't particularly need you to feel sorry for me, but I do ask you to bear with me, and I'll gather myself and carry on. It's part of who I am that sometimes when I'm feeling God's love, it comes out in that form. So that's the first health warning. The second is that I'm really excited about the subject that I'm talking about this morning, and therefore I might go off on a tangent. I might get overexcited. So I give Kerry permission to wave at me, politely smile at me, and if necessary, make it very obvious that, rein it in, Rachel, enough's enough. So, I share responsibility with you on that. So, can everybody hear me? Yeah? So, up a little bit? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, up a little bit, okay. Right, and if during this morning you find that you can't hear me, please signal, because what I have to say feels precious and I want you to at least hear it. What you do with it once you've heard it is your choice, but I'd like to know that you've heard it. When I set out to talk about what I'm talking about this morning, I thought I knew where I was going with it. And as I explored it, I found myself going in a different direction. And that unsettled me. And it challenged me. But given that there's some challenge in the theme, it seemed important that I took up that challenge. So I'm going to share with you my exploration reading that we've had. I purposefully chose the reading from Luke because Luke's version of how Jesus responded to the disciples was slightly softer than how Matthew and Mark put it. And that appealed to me, that Luke recognized the sorrow, that sorrow. But the difference between the versions naturally intrigued me. It's often in the difference from others that intrigue is provoked. But also, it's true that fear is provoked as well. When I find that there is difference, I sometimes have a fear response to that. The first thing I want to talk about is the expression exhausted from sorrow. I have a friend, and he falls asleep when he gets very stressed. It's an involuntary response. And somebody was telling me this week that it's actually a phenomenon that's known in war. It's a rare phenomenon, but a few people have fallen asleep in the height of battle, and it's thought to be a stress response. It can be most awkward for my friend. I remember once that his wife was meant to be back at a certain time, and she wasn't. So another of my friends had gone round to be with him because he was really worried. And my friend, who has this stress response, fell asleep. So one of my friends is sat there trying to give support, and he's gone to sleep. And not only does he go to sleep, he goes to sleep on her shoulder. And then his wife walks in, and then the two friends are feeling very awkward about this whole scene. But fortunately, she knew this was a response that he had. Grief and sorrow is exhausting beyond measure. But grief is not an illness. It's a task. It's a task that lays heavy on our shoulders. The disciples knew some of what was happening for Jesus. They didn't know it all. They couldn't know it all. Even in hindsight, we don't know it all. But I believe that beyond what they knew, they also felt. I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel a burden of something or a stirring of my heart, and I don't yet have words for it. I don't know how to form proper thoughts about it, but I know there's something. And I think the disciples felt some of that. The disciples, if you like, were tasked to grieve with Jesus. It's a task that we're also asked to have. We're asked to have his eyes and his heart. And sometimes the sorrow of that is exhausting. It's important that we don't mix up grief and guilt. They often get mixed up. And I, for one, somehow felt that Jesus was telling the disciples off for not being with him. That he was cross with them for them falling asleep. And then I was reminded that Jesus fell asleep in the boat in Luke 8. The disciples were in angst, to say the least. They thought they were about to drown, and they couldn't believe that Jesus was asleep. So Jesus slept while the disciples were in angst. And Jesus never sinned. So the falling asleep bit can't have been it. And the truth is, we can't carry Jesus' sorrow. It is way too much. Way too exhausting. But that doesn't let us off the hook. That doesn't mean, therefore, we can have a nice long lie-in, ignore all that's going on around us. It doesn't mean that at all. But Jesus understands our humanity. He created us. He knows that we have a need to rest, a need to sometimes switch off. When I was talking with Chris about what I was going to bring today, one of the things he said to me was, it's quite a heavy subject, Rachel. You're not going to leave them in that place of sorrow and heaviness. And I was reminded that Chris, only last week, said, we're not Good Friday people, we're Easter people. So I have no intention of leaving us there, just as I have no intention of not looking at the realities of being human. We couldn't carry Jesus' sorrow. The disciples couldn't carry Jesus' sorrow. No one of us could do what Jesus was about to do when we read this passage. Gratuitousness, I practiced that several times before I said it, redeemed the world and redeems the world. There is no payment that we can make that will cover that cost. That's what Jesus had to do alone. We need to recognize the limits of energy and strength that we as humans have. But we also need to recognize the source of the energy and strength. And that comes from Jesus. And sometimes there is a temptation, particularly in our culture, to believe in an ethic of efficiency. That if we do things a little bit smarter, a little bit neater, cut off all the edges, narrow it down, that we'll be able to manage. And I believe that a certain amount of striving for that is a good thing. But I don't think that is a primary ethic that Jesus asked us to have. I think he asked us to have an ethic of faithfulness. And that's much harder. Because that is an outpouring where we have to rely on somebody or some other. It strikes at the heart of individuality, something that I hold very precious and find very hard to challenge myself about. So when Jesus was asking the disciples to pray, it wasn't because he couldn't carry it. And the praying was not about avoidance. Prayer is about reality. It's about facing reality with Jesus. Reality is way too harsh to face on our own. Hand in hand with Jesus allows us to face reality with our eyes open. We face that reality and discover God in the midst of our tears and sadness. Tears are human speech that I believe God holds very dearly. They express things that we don't have words for. They are a truth and an inner expression that Jesus felt. The shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept. And wept suggests this wasn't polite tears. This wasn't, that's what you're meant to do now. He wept. He felt it. When we feel it, Jesus is alongside us. But in all this feeling of heaviness, I want to share a mustard seed of hope. I want to share the profound belief in God who creates in order to provide joy, goodness, and a place for humanity to live in peace and safety. When John Robinson had made a speech when the Mayflower was about to set off in 1620, he said some very profound things, and I'm going to paraphrase, and they won't be quite as eloquent as what he said. But he said, study the Gospels, and when you think you've got it, go back and study them again. And I found myself thinking about the disciples and what Jesus was really saying to the disciples. And wanting to think about that in a fresh way. Not fresh for the sake of it, but was I really ready to unpack what Jesus had to say to me? And in this reading, I felt my heart stirring and something that I couldn't quite get my head round coming out. And I've spent time, Jim will tell you, pacing up and down in the house and pacing up and down a bit more. And then when he goes out and comes back, he's found me pacing up and down a bit more because I'm trying to get out of my heart what it is. The truth is that in exploring Jesus' journey to the cross, we have to recognise what Chris said about we're never going to fully understand the cross. So that gave me permission to release myself from trying to define it or something and just explore what was going on for me. And I came across this sentence. It's impossible to observe the cross without observing the undergirding energy of love that determines its possibilities. I've been reading this book called Undersong, Listening to the Soul. And as I've been reading it, I've pondered the reason that Jesus asked the disciples to pray. He asked them to pray so they wouldn't fall into temptation. That the nature of sin wouldn't overcome them. What sin? What is it that they weren't to be overcome by? It wasn't that Jesus needed them and they let him down. I believe that the temptation, the very nature of sin, is to exclude. Jesus didn't want the disciples to pray for him, per se. He wanted them to pray for courage, for love, and for wisdom. He wanted them to pray for the ability to include. The refusal to accept another is the refusal to accept oneself. Jesus wanted them to accept others so they could accept themselves. And when Jesus had been on the cross, he came back and he helped them accept themselves after they've done things that they couldn't forgive themselves for. When Peter was mortified by how he'd behaved, Jesus didn't leave him there. Jesus helped him to accept himself. The psalmist says, "My help comes from the Lord." Our help, folks, comes from the Lord. Our help for what? Our help for our vocation. Our vocation to be truly human. God created humans. And when God created humans, he said, it's a good thing. Don't get me wrong. We've messed up so much. and there is a lot of rubbish in the way. But our humanity is created by God. So our vocation is to be truly human, to be truly just. So I think the disciples were asked to pray so they could stay connected to God. So they didn't become exclusive. They didn't allow their fear and their loss to build walls around their hearts that were impenetrable. The cross, if you like, was all the hatred, reaching its final goal, to kill God. Well, that's a stupid notion. God can't be killed. But that was the cosmic act that was trying to be performed. But God conquered all hatred. He conquered death. And in this act, God intended to be reinterpreted in his word as one who loves, forgives, and includes. And there is nothing too big, too awful, too anything for God to include. And if God can include it, them, us, who are we to exclude? Who are we to start saying, that counts, that doesn't, that's important, this person's more important than that person, this person's more like me than that person? God created an opportunity for inclusiveness. If we allow Jesus to be at our centre, we can keep tapped into that. If we unplug from Jesus, if we stop praying, how easy is it to fall into the temptation of sticking with those that we feel most comfortable with? Being truly human, following humanity, is about following Jesus beyond the cross. The cross that set free from superiority and inferiority. The cross that allowed poverty to be something that wasn't a necessity in the world. I am not stood here suggesting the kind of prayer of our close eyes and pretend everything's okay. We need to pray with our eyes open. I'm not telling you actually how to physically pray. I am saying that we can pray with our eyes open because we are praying to the Almighty God who can cope with everything. When we are exposed to the worst of things, we can share with Jesus. We can share our grief. We can share our frustrations. We can share our heart's sorrow. Gandhi, who I'm a bit of a fan of, shared his heart's sorrow at seeing so much poverty. And he said, poverty is the worst kind of violence. And Jesus says, I will walk with you. I have seen the things that you've seen. This is not new to me. I like to think that I had some conversations in prayer. Because Jesus talked so much in the Gospels about poverty and how it doesn't need to be there. And while we consider people to be other, we give ourselves permission for it not to hurt quite so much. But when we accept ourselves and others as truly human, amazing things happen. When Jesus was on the cross, one of the other people that were crucified alongside Jesus, in that moment, accepted himself and others. And look what happened. He got to have that amazing conversation with Jesus. And Jesus said, you're going to be with me. And we need to allow our hearts to be stirred. So that we go beyond the kind of charity that makes the obscene palatable. So that we go to the kind of justice that makes the obscene impossible. Jesus asked the disciples to pray because he wanted them to stay connected with God. I'm going to read you a little bit from this book. It was written by somebody who had discovered a prayer that somebody had written down in Auschwitz. The person who'd written it down died. And they were contemplating prayer. To pray, is to discover that someone else is within your house. To pray is to recognize that it's not your house at all. To keep praying is to have no house to protect, because there is only one house. And the one house is everybody's home. That is the politics of prayer. And that's probably why truly spiritual people are always a threat to politicians of any sort. They want our allegiance, and we can no longer give it. Our house is too big. God's house, he told us, is big enough. He's gone to prepare it to make sure it's big enough. So the question I have for you, for me, is our house. Is it that house? Or are we using exclusivity to create something else? Jesus died on the cross to be inclusive. There is nothing bigger than God. There is therefore no reason that anybody needs to be excluded. If God doesn't need to exclude them, who are we to exclude? So I pray as I finish. Lord, we ask for your strength, for your courage, and for your wisdom. For us to open our hearts and not allow them to be closed through fear or loss or a sense of being overwhelmed. Lord, allow us to feel your love. Allow us to be your hands and your heart in this place. Amen.